Good morning. Today is Wednesday, February 9th. It's 8:32 a.m. and this is a meeting of Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We are following up on S 234, an act relating to changes to Act 250. We're also taking a little bit of testimony on S 200, also a bill relating to Act 250 and master permits, and completing our walkthrough of the bill when Ms. Schakowsky is available. So she has, we made it partway through the bill yesterday. She has commitments in other committees, but she'll be joining us for part of the morning, and we'll pick up that walkthrough when she's back in the room with us. So I just wanted to let people know on the hearing, which is tomorrow night, Thursday, February 10th, 5:30, that for people who haven't been following. So we opened it because it's online. There's a registration form, and when we opened registration within the first 24 hours, we had over 300 registrations, and we've. So part of the registration was you indicated whether you're speaking for or against one or more bills. And so we could basically do what we traditionally do when we're in person, sort of alternate between people for and opposed. We're only going to get to hear a limited number of people off that list, roughly 35 for, 35 opposed, somewhere in that neighborhood. But we've emailed everyone, thanking them for registering and reminding them, as always, they can correspond with any of us by writing directly to us and to the committee. And we'll have a committee. So I'm working on how we, all those emails will be forwarded directly to all senators on the committee so that everyone will have a copy. And with that, I'd like to turn to Mr. Shupe and welcome you into the committee. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on the evolving version of 234, get some feedback on that. And then I had spoken with you offline a little bit about water quality. And so I'm figuring that VNRC in particular has its eye out for the natural resources part of what we're focused on in the bill, and love to hear comments on that as well. So with that, good morning and thank you.
Great, thank you, Senator. I'm Brian Shupe, for Executive Director of Vermont Natural Resources Council. I understand that you haven't walked through the entire bill with Ledge Council yet, but I would like to go through section by section and just provide our comments on each of those sections.
Sure. And just many of the sections we didn't get to, were carried over from a prior version so that the committee has done a walkthrough on them before. For instance, the forestry provisions.
Yep. And I was going to limit my comments on those provisions because Jamie Fidel has testified at length on those. So yes. The first section, which is a major change, it incorporates into the bill the neighborhood planning areas and the designation of neighborhood development areas and neighborhood planning areas, which is existing statute. The most significant change that this bill makes, which does relate to water quality and river corridors, the existing neighborhood planning areas, I get them mixed up. There's the neighborhood planning areas, and then within those areas, there can be designated neighborhood development areas. Currently, the law is that a neighborhood development area needs to exclude river corridors. This allows river corridors to be included in them. And we don't oppose this measure for two reasons. One is that the model bylaws that the Agency of Natural Resources has developed, and I think Rob Evans is going to speak to this probably in greater detail and with more knowledge than I will, allows for a certain amount of infill development to occur, but only in certain instances. It allows them to occur where new buildings are allowed, where they are adjacent to existing buildings, and when they don't encroach any further into the neighborhood development area than existing development already exists. And the reason that this is allowed is that many of our villages and town centers are located along rivers. And in those areas, it's not uncommon for a community to allow infill development in accordance with the state's regulations. And many communities won't include those village areas within their river corridor overlay districts or zoning regulations. So this is not an uncommon practice. And what the law also does, what this change would also say is that if a community does include a river corridor area in their neighborhood development area, they need to have regulations that impose river corridor protection throughout the town. So we view this as a net gain in that communities will be doing a better job of managing river corridor development townwide while allowing limited infill development in certain areas in accordance with the state's model regulations. So that's why we're not opposing that. The section 2, which would change zoning density requirements for new town center designations. We don't oppose that either, but I do want to go on the record as saying of all the designated areas, and we've got growth centers, we've got neighborhood development areas, we've got downtown development districts, we've got village centers. The new town centers is the one that we feel as though has been most poorly applied, and we would like to see it eliminated from all of the designations that are allowed. And if this bill passes and you do the study that's called for it at the end of the bill, we're hoping that the consultant in the state will take a hard look at the new town centers, because we feel as though that's not an appropriate designation and has been poorly applied across the state. I just want to go on record as saying that. Section 3 is a minor change that would just make the expiration of conditional use and site plan approvals at the local level consistent across the state, giving them a 2-year life. They vary from community to community now, and this seems like a reasonable change that just provides consistency. Section 4 would change some definitions, and this is probably the most significant change in the bill. That currently within the neighborhood development areas, the number of housing units that triggers Act 250 is tiered based on the population of the community. And one thing to remember about the neighborhood development areas, unlike most of the other designations, there are environmental standards for eligibility, for designation eligibility, and there are requirements that there be local land use regulations in place. So this is a section that makes us most uncomfortable. The raising the number of units from 25 to 50 units in the smaller communities is especially concerning. We do understand the desire to move ARPA money quickly. We do understand the housing crisis we're looking at. We do understand that we're going to need to be accommodating climate migration, hopefully in a smart growth manner. And what I heard yesterday, and it's not included in this bill, but Senator Bray, you mentioned that your proposal or a concept that you're considering is to sunset this provision at the end of the ARPA dollars, and we would support that provision. You're doing that. January 2027 would be an appropriate time to do that and do a report back to see what's the impact of this. Have there been negative consequences for communities, and whether you could decide at the time whether to continue these caps or to revert back to what the existing law is. Another significant change in the definition is the change to mixed income housing. I really don't have an opinion about what the implications of that are. I see that Jen Holler's ready to testify, so we would defer to the affordable housing community as far as that goes. Section 5 changes some of the water criteria under Act 250. We support that. Our understanding, and again, Rob Evans may speak to this, is just updating it to reflect contemporary science and the policies of the river management program, and it would be an improvement to the Act 250 criteria. Section 7 through 13 mostly involve the forest criteria and the forest processing, as I mentioned, and at the beginning of the testimony that Jamie Fidel did testify at length about this. He did submit extensive written testimony, so I'm not going to comment on this section, but I am available to ask any questions if folks have them. However, I comment on a particular section, which is section 11, and that would reinstate what was known as the road rule, or we call it the encroachment rule. It was a provision of Act 250 that was in place from 1982 to 2002. It was eliminated when the 10-acre loophole was also eliminated. And at the time, it was a little bit controversial because some folks in the environmental community supported it because it did provide a way to exercise Act 250 jurisdiction over scattered residential development in rural areas. It was also flawed, and it resulted in developers going through designing subdivisions in a way that actually had adverse consequences for the environment. We were seeing 790-foot roads, multiple roads created as part of a subdivision. It discouraged more thoughtful land use planning, and we feel as though this road rule or this encroachment rule fixes those flaws. The old regulations required jurisdiction over any road of 800 feet or more. It didn't control or trigger jurisdiction related to driveway development. This rule would fix that by requiring jurisdiction over any combination of road and driveway of 2,000 feet or more. That's a little under 4/10 of a mile. And we feel as though that would not result in the kind of contortions that developers went through under the old road rule. And it would do a couple of things. It would just, in order to avoid Act 250 jurisdictions, we feel as developers would scale back their roads and cluster development, which would be a good outcome. We also feel as though it would provide a good way to use the proposed Act 250 forest fragmentation criteria, because currently very little residential development is triggering Act 250 in the state. I believe, as Jamie testified, we did a study of 22 communities a few years ago, and we found that between 2003, 2009, out of 925 subdivisions that created 2,749 lots that involved over 70,000 acres, only 2% of the subdivisions triggered Act 250. And this would provide a way to capture more of that development that's resulting in forest fragmentation, the development of agricultural soils.
Mr. Shupe, sorry, would you mind just repeating that percentage again? The percentage
less than 2%.
Okay, thank you.
So, and just that involves something I don't remember off the top of my head, something around like 7% of the number of lots were created. And the reason for that is the larger subdivisions were triggering the 10 lot rule. It was less than 10% of lots, fewer than 2% of subdivisions. And I'm not going to repeat Jamie's testimony, but there has been a lot of documentation about the impact of scattered residential development, especially in forest blocks, and the ecological features that are impacted by that. And I also want to just stress the water quality impacts of road and driveway development. Back when Act 64, the Clean Water Act a few years ago was passed, the state exercised jurisdiction over stormwater related to municipal roads, but there are very few municipal roads being developed in rural Vermont. Almost all new roads are private. Driveways are rarely regulated for stormwater impacts or other hydrologic impacts. And this would be an important tool for capturing that development and for discouraging it by providing an alternative for developers to cluster their development rather than spread it out over our hillsides. So we're strongly in favor of that provision. Section 14, we support. That's the provision that would really correct an unfortunate ruling from the Vermont Supreme Court in the Snowstone decision. We're very hopeful that the court is going to reverse that decision. They did agree to reconsider it, and oral arguments were held a couple of weeks ago. BNRC participated in that process by filing an amicus brief and providing arguments. And hopefully you won't need this, but we do strongly support reverting to the precedent that was in place for 50 years that was overturned by the Supreme Court in this decision. Section 15, which I only saw for the first time yesterday, exempt, as I understand it, exempt state-owned airports from the soils mitigation criteria. I haven't really had a chance to talk about that with the folks on our team. We generally are concerned about any changes to the ag mitigation that would weaken the protection of our primary ag soils, but I'd like to listen to some of the other testimony before we weigh in on that and hear what the reasons are and what the implications might be.
Thank you.
Section 16, we have no concerns about providing the court with additional capacity on a temporary basis. Section 17, I don't remember what that is, but we
$17.
Oh, that's the study of agriculture of
Yeah.
jurisdiction over ag businesses. Yeah, we I'm not sure where that came from, but it seems like a reasonable thing to look into. There's long been an issue over how agriculture is regulated or should be regulated, and the committee wants to look into that further. That seems like a good idea. And then section 18, which would study the designation programs. We support that. We would suggest two changes to it though, and I did submit those in writing. There's one of the charges of a consultant would be to look at whether and how to apply regulatory and non-regulatory incentives. We would suggest you add to that that they also look at the mechanisms for addressing potential environmental impacts resulting from new incentivized developments in the designation process, to look at how those designation process are evaluating environmental impacts if they are going to be used to provide different jurisdictional triggers or any other changes in existing regulations. The second change we would add is an additional task or charge for the consultant, a new I, to address how the designating body could be held accountable in the event that designations are granted for applications that don't comply with the designation criteria. We have monitored the designation process for all of the designations for several years. We feel as though the downtown board has generally done a pretty good job, both during this administration and the Shumlin administration, in sticking to the legal requirements for designation. But there have been instances in the past when the board has made decisions which we feel really did not comply with the requirements of the designation program that they were using, and there was no accountability. There's no ability to appeal those decisions or have them second guess it. And in situations where it does change regulatory jurisdiction over Act 250 or any other program, we feel as though the people who might be impacted by those decisions should have the ability to question the body that's making them and hold them accountable. The fact is the downtown board, which again has done a pretty good job, is dominated by governor appointees and administration officials. So it does have the potential to be politicized. And we feel as though, to the extent that designations move in the direction of providing any kind of regulatory relief, that those decisions need to be accountable to folks who might be impacted. So I kind of rushed through things, knowing that you haven't been through the entire bill, but I am available to answer any questions you might have.
Okay. Looking to the committee first. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Shupe? Senator McCormick.
Thanks. Thank you for your testimony. what is the NRC's position on shifting environmental review from the district environmental commissions under Act 250 to the municipalities?
We struggle with it, as you know, and we've had long conversations about this, Senator. And we have historically opposed making shifts in jurisdiction. We also feel as though that had the rules and regulations that exist today, including the designation processes, the level of local and regional planning and land use regulation, been in existence at the time when Act 250 was created, Act 250 may look very different than it does today. And our approach is, if we are going to use targeted designation programs that do involve a level of environmental protection in the designation and do require local land use regulation, that those areas be narrowed, and that the shifting in jurisdiction should include a balanced approach that also does a better job of capturing development in the countryside, where most of the environmental impacts that are occurring in the state are happening, where we can protect water quality and forest fragmentation to a much better degree than we're doing now. So it's not an easy choice for us. We would agree to some narrow jurisdictional shift to the local level, as long as there was a robust designation program and local regulation in place, but only if we were able to capture more of the environmental impacts elsewhere. So I have always appreciated that you've taken a very principled approach to not treating Act 250 as a disincentive for development. And we agree that it has not been a disincentive for development, but we also are taking a pretty pragmatic approach to saying, let's shift the burden to where we can capture more of the environmental impacts than we're addressing today, and not worry as much about impacts in heavily developed areas that have gone through a designation process and are subject to local regulation and other state regulations such as stormwater permitting. That was a long and hopefully not too convoluted answer to your question.
Do you, it seems to me that pretty much every community in Vermont is either on a lake or on a stream or both. How do you feel about surrendering the regional control of impacts on those bodies of water to municipalities?
Well, we currently we supported the creation of the shoreline permitting program that the legislature passed several years ago. We have supported the creation of a river corridor permitting program for the state to better capture development within river corridors and provide disincentives for that. Act 250 isn't the only regulation that we have in the state. And we also feel as though the narrow focus of the neighborhood development areas is hardly surrendering jurisdiction over the state's lakes and rivers. And in this instance, the river corridor area would require that the municipality comply with the state's model regulation for municipalities. So I don't see this as surrendering jurisdiction.
Thank you.
Senator Campion. Sorry, Senator McCormick, did you have another question, comment?
No, I was going to say I'll yield to the senator from Bennington.
Okay, thank you. Senator Campion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just want to return to the airport language for a moment. So am I accurate, Mr. Shupe? You're going to continue to dig into that and get back to us. I mean,
yes.
My point in raising it is I feel that we will, let me be blunt. If this goes with just the road rule in it, we may be subject to a veto. I'd like to give something to our friends. And if this is something that I suspect the pavilion is interested in, and some of my colleagues is interested in, and it would get us to move on the road rule and get a signature rather than a veto. Unless it's doing some serious harm, I think there's some advantage to keeping it in there.
And at the risk of appearing transactional,
Of course.
that is why we have not weighed in on it and want to hear more background
Yeah.
from some of the other witnesses.
Okay, thank you.
And the lead sponsor, I believe, on that bill was Senator Parent. So, yeah, we are, the need to just respond directly, Senator Campion. So we're in discussions with the administration, and there are a lot of ideas out there, and always the art of our work ends up being that we come up with something that's balanced enough that people get over some discomfort in order to move forward because they see a general benefit of moving forward. So I don't know where we are in achieving that kind of balance yet, but that is why it's on the table. Thank you.
Well, if I could add, Mr. Chair, going back to Senator McCormick's question, that desire to strike a balance that provides a way forward on forest protection is why we're here talking about the NDAs and expanding those jurisdictional or raising those jurisdictional triggers.
Right. And then just very briefly on airports, the other thing was this is state owned. This is land already owned by the state at state airports. So at least my preliminary understanding is that this is land very unlikely to ever be returned to agricultural use because of where it's situated. So the merits some special consideration. Senator McDonald.
Just a technical question on the airports. Is the purpose of the change around airports to extend runways or to build housing?
We'll have to have more testimony. We've only had the bill introduction, so.
Okay.
My instinct is not to build a house right next to the airport. I think it is runway expansion, but I could be wrong. It could be for a hangar. It could be for other things. Yeah.
Okay. We'll find it out.
I don't mean to be snarky. I was just thinking, yeah.
Yeah. No, my real question was, Mr. Shupe, why have the changes and exemptions that have been created to date in law been so underwhelmingly used by the very same municipalities that we're going to ratchet up more exemptions for? Why has it been so underwhelming?
I can't answer that. I'm not sure that it has been underwhelming. I think it was created during a time when the housing market was different than maybe it is today. And there's greater demand for housing than there was when these programs were put into effect. But maybe Jen Holler or someone else from the housing community could explain better than I could.
Thank you.
And just as far as your other question, Senator McDonald, just reading the airport thing, it seems pretty clear that it's intended for airport expansion and airport associated uses. But again, having just seen it.
Right. Senator Parent, I think when he was mentioning the development of just the kind of assets that Senator Campion cited, like another hangar, could be an industrial building that's located at the airport. I know that, for instance, at Middlebury, some work was related to, there's a company that services airplanes that's co-located at the airport. And so some of the development was related to enabling them to have customers. It improves their ability to bring in slightly bigger planes. Senator Westman, you were starting to say something about the airport item.
No, go ahead. You're fine. I think you just covered most of it. I don't think it's very rare we have airport length expansions. It generally is hangars and buildings around it. And in the Franklin County airport situation, they're bringing in a fair amount of cargo into that. So I would, I don't know this exactly, but I suspect that what buildings are around there can accommodate that. So it's mostly buildings, not length expansion.
So we will, of course, take more testimony, but any other questions for Mr. Shupe? I do have one around when we were talking about the road rule, and then you were sharing some helpful statistics on development and then in forest areas and the kind of fragmentation that's driven by subdivisions. Has VNRC reviewed, considered amendments or proposing amendments to the subdivision triggers that are in 250? So for instance, now, depending on whether your town has permanent zoning and ordinance, permanent regulations around zoning, you can stay sub-jurisdictional. You can avoid Act 250 by doing up to 9 lots or 5 lots, depending on your situation, which is a substantial amount of development without any trigger being triggered, without Act 250 being called in to look at it. So I wonder, to what degree the road rule is a trigger to try to have higher quality development with lower environmental impacts, not to stop development, but to shape the development. The thresholds, so that could capture ones with particularly long roads. And that's one pressure that forced play, but there also, we saw examples of developments that really didn't have lengthy road systems. They were right along the edge of forest blocks, but we had many driveways. So I'm just wondering if we need both tools, and should the sensitivity threshold for subdivisions be made more sensitive, because a 9-lot subdivision is substantial before, and you would never have a review.
Yeah, we've struggled with this, and we've looked at also whether there's certain locational jurisdictional triggers that should be explored. And we did testify in the House Natural Resources Committee in support of a study looking at locational jurisdiction. The reason we settled on the road rule as being the best policy is it is an encroachment rule. And when you look at the cumulative impact of roads and driveways, we figured this would capture some of the most impactful development. Several years ago, the committee might recall that the Commissioner of Forest Parks and Recreation did a forest fragmentation study. And it's not the exact quote, but my recollection is there was he had a figure that said a single home in a forest block would impact 35 plus or minus acres of surrounding land negatively, would have an impact on some of the important forest values. So our concern is that one house in the wrong place could be worse than 10 houses in the right place. And this would be a way to capture kind of the extent of development as opposed to the number of units. We would certainly be open to changing the number of units that would trigger Act 250 as well. That hasn't been something that we've proposed in recent years. I'm not sure what the right number would be, but for now we feel as though the road rule, as defined in this statute or this bill, would do a good job of capturing a lot of that development. Some of the other the other data that we found in that study that looked at subdivisions was that the vast majority of new lots was being created in so-called rural districts, rural agricultural districts, kind of out in the countryside, and many of which involved long driveways up steep hills. So, whether you considered changing the jurisdictional trigger of the number of units, we would be interested in exploring that with you. But for now, we feel as though this proposal would do a good job of capturing a lot of that development, or at least shaping it to look differently than it does now.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that we weren't paying so much attention to the road rule that we weren't looking at another phenomenon that might be even more impactful. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for your helpful testimony. It's always nice to have a witness who comes in and goes section by section, flagging it as we go, helps us all stay in sync. So thank you again.
Thank you.
With that, I'd like to turn to Deputy Secretary Gendron, and good morning.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having me this morning.
Yeah, great. Well, so you've probably had a chance to look through the new version of S234, and so here we are. We're rolling it out and getting feedback from different parties on what they see, what they like, what they would like to amend, the whole 9 yards.
Understood. Thank you. I've been listening. I was able to catch up on testimony last night that you had yesterday, and clearly was here this morning. Good morning, Chairman and committee members. For the record, my name is Maggie Gendron, and I am the Deputy Secretary for the Agency of Natural Resources. Based on the testimony yesterday, where the committee had some questions, and I heard some further clarification today from Mr. Shupe, but had some questions on the floodplains and river corridors, as well as the requirements related to water and wastewater to the municipal supply within the designated downtown section of your bill. So I brought with me today both Rob Evans, who is the Rivers Program Manager within the Department of Environmental Conservation, and again, brought with me Billy Coster, the Director of Planning and Policy for ANR. Billy's experience in this space is really here to support answering some questions as well that you may have that I can't answer. And of course, any questions that are asked that none of us can answer, we'll follow up with you in writing afterwards. So to prepare for today, I was trying to level set again, because it's easy to get into the weeds, and I always try to bring myself out of it just to remind myself where we started. And so I reviewed my testimony from earlier this year, which I think was in January, where I spoke to the increasingly complex challenges in front of our state, including the climate crisis that's unfolding and presents really unique demographic challenges to our economy and to our environment. With that in mind, I feel like I also highlighted what I saw as a sense of urgency within the housing community to be able to meet the housing needs of Vermonters, and also wanting to prepare our state to effectively take advantage of the ARPA funds that need to be obligated by 2024. And I had also mentioned that a priority for the governor is really to focus on prioritizing those ARPA funded projects in order to support towns with these important infusion of federal funds and really a once in a lifetime opportunity. So that really led to the committee having some conversations with the Agency of Transportation, NRB, and housing community to better understand that need, and does it intersect with Act 250 permitting, and what are the realities around that? And I watched much of that testimony as well. Chairwoman Haskell of the NRB, she's going to be in front of your committee on Friday, and she's the lead spokeswoman to sharing the opinion of the administration on the comprehensive scope of S234. But I did want to make a couple of comments in anticipation of that conversation. First, ANR does support the expansion of priority housing unit exemptions in neighborhood development areas. This increases an existing incentive to site mixed income housing and state designated growth areas, and it provides that incentive quickly to take advantage of the ARPA funding window. Second, ANR also supports revisions to how floodplains and river corridors are addressed in the NDA designation process in Act 250 Criteria 1D. However, these are technical corrections that bring those programs in line with current science and practice regarding flood management. And again, I have Rob Evans here today to answer any questions you have around that. You also heard lengthy testimony from Commissioner Snyder on the forest provisions, and his testimony remains true today, even with your strike all. So recognizing also what Mr. Shupe had said, you haven't gone through the bill in completeness. So we're talking to this before you've had the opportunity of that. But the remainder of this bill, however, really has a mix of provisions that do not constitute a comprehensive reform of Act 250. And while there are individual pieces that ANR supports and individual pieces we oppose, the overall package is not one that the administration can support. So Senator Campion really diplomatically highlighted this both today and yesterday, but S-234 does include the road rule, which you've talked about in length with Mr. Shupe as well, which authorizes the most significant expansion of Act 250 jurisdiction within the program. And this road rule provision was amended even further than your first draft. And the governor has been clear that over the years, he's been clear on this, even though I've only been here for a year. I understand that to be true, that the road rule is one he opposes and just cannot support. And from ANR's perspective, the increased complexity of review resulting from the new criteria and significant increase in Act 250 application numbers associated with the increased jurisdiction will hit ANR the hardest, more than other state agencies. Our technical staff will be required to review all of these applications and engage at district commissions across the state. And the agency's capacity to participate in the Act 250 process is already stressed. And we are also preparing for an anticipated increase in activity due to ARPA-funded projects. So the road rule, without other important components to balance that expanded jurisdiction, is a stress to the system and will not improve the Act 250 process for applicants. So what's in this bill is as important as what is not in this bill. And that's going to be different for you, clearly, than for the governor. And while that I recognize that you've made considerable changes to S-234, the bill before us does not strike the balance necessary to gain the governor's support. And I think I'm going to reference what I heard earlier this morning. I know this is disappointing to hear, and I'm likely the skunk at the party this morning. But as I learned the ropes, I think being fourth rope is probably more respectful to your time than not being forthright. So I want to end acknowledging that I think we all agree that Vermont's land use and development law is important. And I imagine our conversations likely get more difficult as we move through this bill. But thank you for listening to me this morning. And again, I would love for you to be able to access Rob Evans, who's here today, to answer any of the questions that you had yesterday about floodplains and river corridors. So with that, I will pause.
Thank you very much. Forthright, we appreciate. So we might as well, time is precious for everyone. And so the sooner we know where, what people are thinking, the better for all of us in terms of trying to find a path forward. Do you want any, in terms of the bill not being comprehensive enough, is that, do you want to say anything more on what features the administration would be looking for? Like, is what we're not addressing that would increase the scope to feel like it's comprehensive enough and balanced enough?
I think that is probably the most difficult question to answer for me regularly on this particular piece of legislation, mostly because the balance is nuanced, and I think it deserves a really thoughtful conversation where people have to sit down in a room together and hash that out. And so it's a hard conversation to have for me right now, and I don't think I'm prepared to have it, but happy to keep trying to get there.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. I don't want to press you on it. It's just like you said, well, for instance, there's this, that, or the other thing, and we hope you'll consider that. That's fine. But I completely understand there's a lot of subtlety and interplay between different figures. So we'll keep on working to see what kind of progress we make. It reminds me of a certain Supreme Court definition. You'll know it when you see it. Right. Okay.
I've heard that Supreme Court decision referenced in several committees, so it's catching on these days.
Yeah. not saying what they were defining at the time.
I know.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. Any questions for the Deputy Secretary from the committee? Okay. Well, great. So we did have questions and just wanted to better understand the river corridor features and updates. I know that they are in a certain way housekeeping, but then there's other pieces that are sort of reinterpret how where development is allowed, for instance, and what kind of development in terms of the exposure to rivers. And so I would just state the most plain concern that I think the committee shares is we wouldn't want to see, and I'm sure you don't want to see, but we don't want to see infill development that then exacerbates any kind of situation on the ground when we do have inevitable flooding events. So can you talk us through a little bit how these changes are work in terms of managing development smartly at the same time that we know that we've historically built in places that tend to flood?
That is a great question for Mr. Evans, who I have here with me today and is going to be much better at walking you through it than I will. So Rob, if you are here, I would love for you to address that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, happy to jump in. Good morning, Chair Bray and committee members. Happy to be with you this morning. And again, for the record, I'm Rob Evans, and I manage the Rivers program within the DEC Watershed Management Division. Very important questions around striking the balance in terms of managing for flood hazards, climate adaptation, achieving our water quality goals. At the same time, facilitating our growth patterns, our compact settlements, and what all that looks like. I think I'll just start high level just to repeat what you've already heard. I think, Brian Shupe did a great job explaining why we need some added flexibility to the neighborhood development area designation requirements while ensuring appropriate regulation townwide with respect to flood hazards and riverine erosion hazards. And then, as both Deputy Secretary Gendron and Brian also said, that there's really a long-standing need to modernize the floodways criterion definitions and standard in Act 250 to align with current policy and definitions that are currently in chapters 32 and 49 of Title 10 and implemented through the agency rule and procedures. Updating these terms will really help tremendously to minimize confusion with those regulated under Act 250. So with that, I think it's important to, start with, appreciating what the key distinction is between flood hazard areas and river corridors, because I think that'll be a good lead in or segue to talking about kind of managing land uses in the state and in our compact centers. So flood hazard areas are those areas that are mapped by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They depict flood inundation hazards, what is going to be underwater during a large flood. Communities enrolled in the National Flood Insurance Program, along with the state under its land use authorities, are required to permit development in these federally mapped flood hazard areas in exchange for access to federal flood insurance and federal hazard mitigation grant funding. River corridors, on the other hand, are mapped by ANR, by my program in particular, and they identify that minimum valley bottom space on the valley floor needed for rivers to be least erosive, that area the river needs to adjust, to meander, to deposit and erode sediment, to store floodwater. Riverine erosion hazards related to our dynamic rivers are our primary flood hazard in Vermont in terms of cost and frequency. So keeping new development out of river corridors is of primary importance along undeveloped river reaches up and downstream of our cities, towns, and villages. Again, by protecting river corridors, we facilitate floodwater storage, sediment storage. Think of river corridors as a means to store floodwater, to dissipate energy and sediment before the flood pulses through downtown. River corridors are really about maximizing what we call natural and beneficial floodplain function. So, really protecting, restoring our macro scale green infrastructure. So it's really a key tool in our toolkit related to achieving our flood resilience and water quality goals. So having said that, and now with hopefully setting the table and getting to your question, well, what about development and how do we ensure that development is safe? To be clear, as pointed out earlier, I think by one of the committee members, so much of our existing settlements by way of our historic settlement patterns is along rivers and river valleys. So we have existing risk there, to be sure. At the same time, we have the goal of concentrating, our development in these compact centers and making them more vibrant. So we need to strike the balance here. River corridors are really focused on, again, letting rivers flood and adjust and move over time. I'll use a very extreme example. If you think of the Winooski River as it goes through downtown Montpelier, we have so much investment there. Then we have what we call a channel management commitment to keep the river where it's located. We're not letting the Winooski River meander through downtown Montpelier. We have too much investment there. We will continue to manage that river. So as Brian pointed out, we have provisions both in our state authorities and in the model bylaws we recommend to towns to allow infill development there because we're already committed to protecting that existing investment. So additional infill development doesn't add additional risk to that infill development in terms of erosion hazards. Again, because we're committed to managing the river in its current location, which is distinctly different than up and downstream where we have rural reaches of river and we have a lot of opportunity for the river to continue to adjust and maintain a stable slope and plan form. So then what we're left with, if we kind of push aside river corridor considerations in our existing settlements and downtown areas, is really what's in place already in some form or fashion for 90% of our communities, which is looking at those inundation hazards. We know that Montpelier will be underwater again, given its location. 90% of our communities are enrolled in the National Flood Insurance Program. So at the minimum, they have federal inundation standards to ensure that development that goes in those inundation flood hazard areas is built in a way that that minimizes flood risk with respect to inundation, elevating buildings above flood level, flood proofing, making sure utilities, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, all of those things meet certain standards so they're not damaged during a flood. So we have those provisions through most municipalities, and then we also have state authorities. So we have Act 250 when jurisdictional, that looks at both inundation and erosion hazards to high standards, higher than the federal minimums. And we also have our flood hazard area and river corridor rule that regulates a subset of activities that towns aren't allowed to regulate. That includes state-owned buildings and facilities, power generation and transmission facilities that are subject to the Public Utility Commission process, and then required agricultural and silvicultural process. So it's a bit of a patchwork in Vermont in terms of various authorities, municipal Act 250, and then our own state rule. But among those three, by and large, in our existing settlements, there is consideration of new development being built to standards to resist flooding. And I'll just close with a large scale example, which was the proposal to put a new Hampton Inn hotel behind Capitol Plaza there, right next to the river. Again, river corridor considerations not really appropriate given the nature of investment already there, right to the top of the riverbank. But there was substantial design that went into that proposal to ensure that it was elevated and flood-proofed and would be resilient to an elevation well above the what's referred to as the 100-year flood. So again, that doesn't remove all risk when we put infill development in these areas, but there's a way that we can to mitigate that risk. So I'll stop there because I'm sure you might have additional questions.
Any committee questions? Thank you very much. Any committee questions for Mr. Evans? Senator McCormick.
Sorry, it took that long to unmute.
You made it.
I did it. It was the machine, not me. You mentioned earlier that Act 250 has higher standards when applicable for water for streams than federal standards. Did I hear you correctly on that?
You did. One nuance there, just to be clear, is because it's the district commissions that are ultimately issuing the permit, they're the permitting authority. Our role through Billy Coster's shop is to make regulatory recommendations. So we have a department procedure signed by our commissioner that lays out what those regulatory recommendations are in terms of higher standards. But yes, we recommend higher standards that exceed those federal minimums.
So it seems to me logically then, if we were to remove Act 250 jurisdiction, being comforted by the idea that there are still federal regulations, that in essence, we would be lowering our standards.
Not as.
Would you comment on that?
Yeah, I believe not as contemplated in S234, because the requirement for neighborhood development areas is to adopt standards that are consistent with our state model bylaws, and those align with our higher standards in Act 250. We've tried to make sure that what we recommend to towns and encourage them to adopt is consistent with what we administer either through Act 250 or through our rule. So I don't think we would necessarily be giving up anything in that regard. And then a comment that was made earlier, I think it might have been you, Senator, about, in relation to this. It's also important to realize that through Chapter 117, our zoning statutes, there's a requirement that towns submit their hazard permit applications, meaning in flood hazard areas and river corridors. Before they issue a permit, there's a mandatory requirement that they submit those permit applications to my office for review and comment. And so we provide that technical review. It basically puts my shop in a consultative role where we look at the permit application, we look at the bylaws they've adopted, and we say, yes, this permit application meets those requirements, proceed forward. We might recommend certain conditions be attached, what have you, or we might circle back and say, hey, this permit falls short. The developer, their developer's consultant needs to provide additional information or modify the design to comply with the local bylaws. So we are plugged into that local hazard permitting process by way of that mandatory requirement, if that makes sense.
And then you either approve or disapprove.
We provide written comments. Again, our comments are just advisory. It's required that the town get our comment before issuing the permit. So we submit written comments. It's usually in the form of a letter for complicated projects. If it's something simple, like somebody putting a shed behind their house, it might be in the form of email comments. So it kind of depends on the scale and the complexity and risk associated with the development, but we don't approve officially. No. Yeah, to be clear, the town can take or leave our comments because they have obligations to remain compliant with the federal flood insurance program. And if they issue permits that are not compliant with the federal flood insurance program, they can be suspended, lose access to flood insurance. So most towns heed our recommendations in my experience, but they don't have to. They're just wise to do so.
That's like the game warden who told me if I fire a single shot over a bear's head after he's entered my house, he'll probably run away. Thanks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
I see you don't want to have a single shot gun with you at the time.
That's right.
Thanks. When you were talking about the state model bylaws, basically sort of being Act 250 equivalent in terms of their anticipated benefit, function, and all the rest, do towns have to adopt those so these are model bylaws, so they're optional for some towns, but I just want to make sure I have the nuts and bolts of this straight in 234. In 234 for NDAs, they would have to adopt the model bylaws. It's not optional, but it's just that they're offered as a model to other towns that may or may not move forward with an NDA or any other kind of designated area. Is that right? Okay.
Correct. There are a couple of pieces to that. We recognize, really, by way of the General Assembly asking us why we kept getting flooded so much in the late 90s, that really set in motion an evolution of the program, my program, as you see it today, over 20 years in the making. There was a recognition that the federal minimum standards weren't doing enough to protect us. It was still allowing encroachment, risky development. It didn't consider erosion hazards. So back in 2008 or so is when we really dialed up model regulations that were over and above the federal minimums and recommending those as best practice to towns to adopt to really achieve flood resilience in a more meaningful way. So yes, optional in that regard, it's a good idea, best practice. After Tropical Storm Irene, there were amendments to the State Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund. That's an agency of administration rule that sets forth our cost share against federal disaster recovery dollars. And that rule was amended. I want to say it went into effect in 2014. I think it was amended 2012 to create incentives for towns to adopt our higher standards and our model bylaws. And so it created a sliding scale. The more towns do, including adopting our model bylaws, the more cost share they get from the state. So it was a way to create a financial kind of carrot for towns to say, gee, there's actual real disaster recovery dollars. Those disaster recovery dollars, to be specific, are FEMA public assistance grants. Those are the grants that put back public facilities and infrastructure. That's what paid to rebuild the Waterbury office complex. That's what almost annually we get a federal declaration that puts back municipal roads and bridges and road embankments, our transportation infrastructure. So are real dollars that attach to adopting our model standards. Around 50 towns are qualified at the highest level of our cost share. And then some are qualified, but not at the highest for adopting some of our higher standards. So we've had some uptake there in terms of the adoption of those standards voluntarily, because there's dollars in consideration there. But that's plateaued in recent years. It's kind of leveled off.
So I'll give you a lay question for like thinking about a downtown that gets more filled in. So there's a little less room for the water to spread out when a flood event comes along. I'm guessing that you've figured out that it's okay I'm wondering what that does to the speed of the water, et cetera. Does that mean that it becomes a place where the water accelerates more because it's more channelized by the additional development? And does that have a negative impact on sections immediately downstream, or how do you balance that kind of thing out?
Yeah, that's a great question and a really important one. I guess, let's start kind of, upstream of the existing settlements in the downtowns. Again, what we're trying to achieve by way of our standards is, again, restoration, protection of those floodplain assets, that floodplain function. So we can maximize that slowing down of floodwaters, that storage or that attenuation, as we call it, that energy dissipation. There's definitely potential for development to impact immediately adjacent development or development downriver. I'll go back again because it was a very robust set of analysis and requirements that went through with that proposed hotel. They had to do extensive hydraulic modeling, calculations to model the river and this huge mound of fill they were going to place the hotel on to show that it wasn't going to increase velocities to adjacent buildings. Given all the bridges and kind of the context and location of the river there are already very slow velocities moving through Montpelier. So they're able to demonstrate, de minimis impacts in that regard. The storage is kind of lost in Montpelier, given the level of, parking lot and buildings and things like that. But our state authorities and our model bylaws, they're framed under a the standards are framed as really being geared at no adverse impact. So we don't want development to increase flood elevations, the height or depth of water. We don't want development to increase the velocities, to your point. And then thirdly, where the river corridor comes in, we don't want it to exacerbate riverine erosion, either by being put at risk from riverine erosion itself, or creating a new channel management commitment where we need to armor the banks of the river anew. That armoring triggers system instability and additional erosion that can undermine bridge abutments, affect other property owners. So that's the lens at which we've set up, these regulations and bylaws, is to have no adverse impact to the extent we can achieve it.
Okay, thanks very much. That was very helpful. I know that over this way, so I'm in Bristol, the Otter Creek approaching Middlebury has, Salisbury, there's a huge floodplain. And there was a study done that kind of, the river attenuated, a lot of energy for the flood, and Middlebury suffered something like $3.5 million less flood damage by virtue of having that space for the river to expand into. So
that's a textbook example that others outside of our state share widely, that study and that impact. I mean, the quick numbers are the watershed area between Center Rutland and Middlebury. The watershed area of Otter Creek doubles in size, yet the peak flood discharge of Irene was cut in half because of the storage of the Otter Creek. So that is a textbook example of maximized beneficial floodplain function, wetland complex benefits, et cetera.
Okay, well, thank you. Senator McDonald.
One of the things we learned during Irene is that the federal flood insurance and laws and practice and history is based on Midwestern floods in the great valleys of the Ohio and the Mississippi, of which Otter Creek mimics at a much smaller area. And the witnesses said that it's okay to build in the downtown flood areas if you account for Vermont rivers, which in the Montpelier area flow much faster and cause more damage. And the witness cited the proposed construction of the hotel here in Montpelier that eventually was canceled. Would the witness tell us, the officials in Montpelier said that the hotel wasn't built because of Act 250 issues. Is that a correct analysis, or was it not built because of the inappropriate place and the amount of investment that it would have been required to meet the flood standards?
I can't speak to what other criteria were problematic insofar as Act 250. I know that we, at my program level, and reviewing it under the 1D floodways criterion, ultimately signed off on the design. But I can't speak to why the program or the project fell apart. I know there was a lot of local concern, and there was also local permitting, and there was discussion around the parking garage, and it was very contentious, is all I can remember. But I don't know ultimately what it was, and maybe Billy Coster, my colleague who's on, can speak to that. But it wasn't from my program's perspective in our review under the floodways criterion, the design met our requirements in terms of demonstrating no adverse impact.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Senator McDonald.
We've taken some testimony this morning, and I keep trying to understand what the goal of this legislation is: to reform Act 250, or to facilitate affordable housing in downtowns. And which is it?
Well, I would say, based on the the refrain of one of my favorite kids' books growing up was Why Choose? You know, like I don't mean to be flip. I think we're looking at enhancing smart planning, growth and development, particularly in designated areas. We're also interested in increasing our ability to plan to protect the green spaces we have. And one of the pressures driving that development is the need for housing. So I think we're trying to keep our eyes wide open and look at how we put together a bill that addresses many different needs from different parties, all with an interest in seeing us find a way to move forward. You know. I'll just back up a little bit and say we've had 3+ years of an inability to make progress on Act 250 issues. You know, for instance, I don't know that it's contentious at all that anyone would want to improve the cross references to modern statute and to clarify for people in Act 250 that they should be referring to the most recent rules that ANR is promulgated. But we haven't even been able to get some of that housekeeping done because we've run aground on other things. So there's a certain amount of housekeeping. There's this, you know, I would love to see us find a way to begin to make progress again, knowing that there are other things that are contentious enough that we would leave them for another day. So
I've heard a couple times that our bill appears to be, in the eyes of some, to be unbalanced. So I'm, I guess, perhaps struggling to learn that. And thank you very much for permitting me to ask the questions. Yeah,
no, I hope my answer didn't imply I didn't want to hear that question. No, this is a little bit like improv theater. We're going to be responding to what we're learning as a group and figuring things out. So at least that's the model I think of. Okay, well, if there are no further questions from Mr. Evans, that was very helpful. Thanks for sharing your expertise on that. Mr. Koster, good morning. I don't know if you've heard, we've covered a number of different things, but I don't know if there's other areas of discussion you've heard relative to ANR where you feel like you'd like to offer some comments or insights, feedback to the committee.
Good morning. Thank you. Billy Koster, Agency of Natural Resources. I think Maggie and Rob did a great job covering most of it. The only remaining piece that I'm happy to speak to is that there is a provision of S234. Let me just find it. That begins on, let's see, the top of page 4. That strikes the requirement for neighborhood development areas to be served by municipal sewer infrastructure or a community or alternative wastewater system approved by ANR.
Right.
We've had the Groundwater and Drinking Water Protection Program and DEC look at that provision, and they support striking those requirements. While certainly it's good to have municipal infrastructure feeding dense development, those requirements may preclude other forms of infill development in neighborhood development areas that could be served by on-site sewer or wastewater. So all these developments are still going to need to obtain appropriate permits, get appropriate water and wastewater service for their projects. So while it's certainly a best practice to site dense development in areas that have municipal infrastructure, it's certainly not always necessary. So removing these restrictions doesn't present a problem, and in fact may present opportunities for additional infill where that infrastructure is not available. So that's the only remaining piece that wasn't covered by us today. So that's the extent of my comments. Thank you.
Okay. So one way I think about that section you're referring to, so that is in top of page 4, 6AB, that by removing it as a municipal requirement to get the designation, there's still a requirement for the same sort of performance in terms of managing water and water quality. But it falls then to the developer rather than to the municipality to ensure that. Is that a fair way of characterizing it?
I think that that's a reasonable characterization. I guess I would reframe it this way, that ultimately it always falls to the developer. They're the responsible entity to make sure that their water and wastewater is being managed appropriately and complies with regulation. The current language limits their options in neighborhood development areas to just municipal systems. And that by striking that language, it provides them greater options to address water and wastewater service if on-site options are available to them. So I don't think that the municipality was ever responsible per se for that. It just, the current language limited what could be included in a neighborhood development area to only areas served by municipal systems. And that may not be necessary to support the goals of neighborhood development areas.
Okay, well, fair enough. When I said falls to, I don't mean like, we're just shifting it, just that they always had that responsibility. And actually we took some testimony from builders who were citing just how expensive it was actually to connect to existing municipal systems. It didn't turn out, I think the testimony we heard was surprising to all of us a little bit. It wasn't as though that pre-investment on the part of the community necessarily made the housing that much less expensive because of a municipal wastewater system, for instance.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Well, that's helpful to understand that. Also, in terms of this ARPA framing that is kind of operating in the background in this bill, or sometimes in the foreground, like trying to do timely development. I can imagine if you were to say that a municipality should bond and build out municipal waste infrastructure, that infrastructure might not be in place for several years, and we might miss the sort of ARPA bus.
Yes, and I know Deputy Secretary Gendron can speak to this, but our agency is managing significant amounts of ARPA funds targeted at expanding kind of village wastewater systems, and it's on the same timeline as the housing money. So while we hope to get those monies allocated and those projects underway quickly, they're complex and will take some time.
Right. I think there was money last year, right? Is there money again this year for that sort of, I don't know. I think the story we heard was someone was going to do a village, either a new village store or sort of rehabilitate and continue a village store. But one of the things they had to address was wastewater, and it was so expensive that it was enough to sort of sink the project without state assistance.
Yep. We would encourage the legislature to support the governor's budget to continue ARPA spending within the village wastewater program for that reason. And there's infrastructure dollars coming that have different subsidies attached to them, but those two pots of money together could really make an impact on Vermont's underground infrastructure that's necessary to support our towns and villages.
Okay. Are those village wastewater systems necessarily municipal, or they can be public-private or entirely private, and you do grants? Do you know?
It's public. These are intended for public systems.
Okay. All right. Great. So thanks, Mr. Koster. I'm just flipping through to look at where I had other things marked to get testimony from your department agency, and I think for the moment I'm all set, but we won't be shy about asking more questions if they come up. Okay. Any other questions? Senator McDonald.
Just, if it's cheaper for a developer to not hook up to a existing municipal wastewater system and to perform some alternative wastewater system, and there's a flood and it goes awry, where does the who's responsible for, and how does the cleanup get paid for?
I don't know the answer to that question. If nobody else here does, I can get back to you on that.
Well, in the case of a developer who did hook up to the municipal sewage system, and that system went awry, where does the money or the correction, how is that paid for?
I'll jump in here. There is an opportunity to pay for it with FEMA dollars. Again, there's that public assistance flood recovery funding that comes. It attaches to a federal presidential declaration, so it needs to be of that scale for that money to flow. But that's available to flood-proof, elevate, address public infrastructure, including water and wastewater infrastructure. So there's distinct difference there in terms of that funding source, whether it's private or public.
And I just want to be clear that, you know, we're supportive of removing these requirements, not necessarily because an on-site system may be less costly than a municipal hookup when that hookup is available. And I don't even know if that would be the case. More, we're focused on opportunities where municipal infrastructure does not exist, but where viable on-site alternatives could exist, and not precluding those areas from a neighborhood development designation.
And in the view of the witness, does the language limit those choices to where the infrastructure does not exist, or does it permit it in where it does indeed exist if the developer wishes to not hook up to it?
The current draft of your bill does not condition a neighborhood development area designation on the presence or absence of municipal water and wastewater. It's neutral on that point. I don't know if I'm answering your question, Senator, but I think that's what you're asking.
So by virtue of being neutral on that point, you may have a wastewater system available, and the developer may choose not to use it, and because that's their choice, and provide evidence or assurance that there'll be no problems. Is that correct?
They would need to obtain other state permits to treat their wastewater or obtain their water service on site or without the benefit of those municipal services. So there's a whole regulatory framework that would look at how they would procure those services.
And in the event that things went awry, they would not be eligible for the FEMA money because they did not hook up?
I don't know the answer to that.
Well, that's kind of like a key question to answer when we offer this alternative. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right. I'm finding myself a little puzzled, so I'm going to ask a question. So Senator McDonald, when you're saying if something went awry, and we're talking about someone choosing not to hook up to municipal waste, as in the example, I think you said there's a municipal waste system, someone builds on a lot, maybe it perks incredibly well. They say it's going to be cheaper to use septic. They do on-site septic. Now there's a flood event, and you're saying by virtue of having chosen to do your own septic, as opposed to connect to the municipality, will FEMA look at your house differently than your neighbors who's connected to the wastewater system, the municipal wastewater system? Did I get it right?
Who's left holding the bag?
Okay, so I don't know what bag is being held around wastewater and flooding. Maybe Mr. Evans can sort that one out.
I would, sorry to jump in here. I'd encourage you to get to finer details of the flow of FEMA money to perhaps ask Ben Rose from Vermont Emergency Management. He oversees the FEMA public assistance grant funding program that pays for public infrastructure, He also oversees their hazard mitigation assistance pot of money that also in peacetime can provide mitigation grant funding. So I think he could get into the nuance of that question better than any of us here.
Okay. Thank you. It's always helpful to get a witness recommendation so we know who to call. Thank you. All right. With that, Mr. Coster, you've artfully brought us up just to the break time. So we will take a break for our half an hour. We'll reconvene at 10:30 and